All right, thanks for coming, everybody. Happy Monday. So today we're going to continue talking about plankton. We're almost finished on Friday, but not quite, so we have a little bit more to do. And then we'll start talking about larger organisms in the ocean, since most plankton are very small, in particular when we start talking about nectonic organisms, those that swim relatively strongly. We're mostly going to be talking about larger organisms because you have to have a certain size to be able to swim that strongly. So we'll also interlude a little bit with the discussion of the origin of animals. So we were talking about zooplankton on Friday, and we had gone through a few of the major groups. In particular, we talked about foraminiferans and radiolaria, both single-celled organisms with spines, forams making their shells out of calcium carbonate, and radiolarians making their shells out of SiO2 and contributing to the relevant forms of marine sediments. Pretty much the rest of the organisms we're going to talk about in this class are multicellular and larger, and that's going to go for the last two types of zooplankton we talked about, including the ostracods, and in a minute, also the copepods. Actually, both of these groups of organisms belong to the crustaceans, which we might normally associate with organisms like lobsters or shrimp or crabs, or actually on land, pill bugs are also crustaceans, so some of them actually live on land. Ostracods are water-living organisms, either in the ocean or in freshwater, and they look a little bit like shrimp, but they have a shell that actually is grown around their bodies to make something that looks a little bit like a clamshell. And so you can think of them as being something like a clam shrimp. And they're a little bit bigger than the other types of plankton we've talked about. The phytoplankton were typically on the order of 1/10 of a millimeter or less in size. Forams and radiolaria can be a little bit bigger, maybe 1/4 of a millimeter across, and in some unusual cases actually bigger than that even. Ostracods are actually big enough that you can see them with your naked eye without too much trouble, although you might not be able to make out the details. They're like little bugs, basically. And they may be bioluminescent. They consume plankton, and they do so fairly actively. So they actually generate currents to bring those phytoplankton near their mouths, or they actually graze when they live near plants attached to the bottom, for instance. Copepods are another group of zooplankton that are, again, crustaceans. They're a little bit larger than the other things we've talked about, of order a millimeter or so in size. They can be much bigger or a little bit smaller than that. There are many, many types of copepods, and they're remarkably successful organisms in the ocean. In fact, probably one of the most common organisms in the ocean, certainly in terms of mass and in terms of numbers. They're a big component of what's going on in the zooplankton community. You find them all over the place. In fact, when we used to take plankton tows in Marina del Rey, when UCLA had a research vessel, we pretty much pulled up 90% copepods, and there were lots of them living there in Marina del Rey, which is perhaps not the cleanest water in the world, but they actually were perfectly happy there. They're organisms, they look a little bit like bugs. They're kind of obviously crustaceans. They have two prominent sets of antennas that you can see quite easily, even in a micrograph, and they actually have other sets of antennae, a smaller set of antennae as well. So here you can see mostly the bigger set of antennae. They have, in general, one eye, and sometimes they're called cyclops. That eye is mostly used for, kind of figuring out which way is up. Are they in the light or are they in the dark? But they're not, using binocular vision to hunt down their prey. They actually use primarily other senses to figure out how to get their food. So like ostracods, copepods are actually kind of a little bit more active in seeking out their food. They actually generate currents. They wave their appendages in the water and generate currents that actually will sweep food by their mouths where they can choose the bits they want to eat. And so what's being shown here is actually a holographic movie. And it's the same copepod. So this is the copepod, it's order a millimeter in size. And here we're looking at them down from above. And here we're looking at them from the sides. You can actually see the legs that it's actually using to generate currents. And if you look closely, you can actually see little particles of probably mostly phytoplankton being swept by as this thing sweeps its arms and does its feeding motions. So hopefully you can see that there's a little current going by this guy. And then right at the end, he actually moves a little bit. And this is just looping, so it's going to loop around again. So most of the time when they're just sitting there getting their food, the ones that are primarily living on phytoplankton, they're just generating these feeding currents and sweeping the particles by their mouths. But then if he decides he's in a little bit of danger or he's not where he wants to be, he can actually move quite a bit more abruptly than that using the antenna. Okay. And this sort of feeding currents that the copepods generate have been subject to lots of interest among people who do fluid dynamics. It's really interesting to study how fluid dynamics works for very tiny organisms, where water actually behaves quite a bit differently than it does for large organisms like fish or submarines. And so there's been quite a bit of effort put into understanding how these little organisms make their feeding currents. And this is just one example from a movie like what I just showed you, trying to figure out how is this organism actually generating those currents that bring food by its mouth. And so what we're seeing here are these little loops, which are color-coded according to the current speed, and the loops themselves indicate the direction of the current going past the copepod, which is here kind of rendered in this computer graphics, with this side being where the mouth is. And so this is just a little 3D view where it's rotating around, and you can see they're generating strong currents right here where they actually want the food to come by so they can eat it. And actually a pretty good current, so it's a current equivalent to the body length of the organism every second. So they're actually able to sample quite a bit of water to get their food out. All right, so that's copepods. So when I talked about phytoplankton in particular, I mentioned that, of course, our knowledge of these organisms in the ocean is quite incomplete, in particular because many of the organisms that are probably most abundant are very, very small, and they're difficult to separate out of ocean water using something like a plankton net, which can only catch things that are at least as big as the holes in the net. And so once an organism gets to be 1/millionth of a meter or even smaller in size, it's very difficult to design a net with holes that small. So those organisms tend to just pass right through unless they're clumped together or somehow otherwise aggregated. Over the past 50 years, however, people have recognized that this is an issue, and they've designed better filtration systems and other ways to concentrate living things from seawater, and we've started to learn more about the very small organisms in the ocean, most of which are phytoplankton. And so we've sort of discovered a new class of organism in the ocean called picoplankton, and these are organisms that are much smaller than 1/millionth of a meter in size. Some of them are actually eukaryotes in the same domain of life as us, and that's normally associated with fairly large cells, but some of these organisms are truly tiny. So these are some pictures by Claire Ting at Williams College. And the scale bar here is 1/2 millionth of a meter, so 500 nanometers. This is 1/millionth of a meter, the scale bar here. And you can see that these organisms are tiny, 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 tiny on that scale. And yet you can see structures inside their bodies. They can do photosynthesis as well as anything else. And they're so tiny that you could fit many, many of them inside one diatom, which is a pretty small organism in and of itself, but would dwarf any of these things. And these organisms, because they're so small, actually may be numerically the most abundant things in the ocean. And also because they're so small, they can probably make do with some not very hospitable environments, in particular perhaps with environments where the abundance of nutrients is very low. For instance, in a subtropical gyre where the surface water has been at the surface for a long time, organisms have been dying and removing nutrients from it. It's going to be a very difficult place for an organism that wants to do photosynthesis to get what it needs out of that water. But these organisms actually seem to do fairly well in those environments. All right. So are there any questions about plankton? Okay. So having talked about the types of plankton, it's important to discuss their behavior a little bit. And I've already made lots of mentions in particular of how they're sensitive to nutrients and how they can bloom, reproduce rapidly in the presence of nutrients in shallow waters or in waters near the surface. It's also important to realize that they actually will migrate depending on what the conditions are like. In particular, many types of plankton will migrate in and out of the sunlit part of the ocean at night or during the daytime, depending on what they're trying to do. So zooplankton organisms, for instance, may commonly migrate down during the daytime. They don't need the sun to do photosynthesis, and as long as they're in the sunlight, they're susceptible to being spotted by some larger organism and getting eaten. So it's common for zooplankton to actually spend the daytime in the darker parts of the ocean a little bit deeper and migrate up towards the surface at night to try to find some other organisms to eat themselves. And of course, where the zooplankton are going, whatever eats the zooplankton is going to tend to follow. So in fact, every night in the surface ocean, there's a big migration of whole suites of organisms up towards the surface and then back down again when the sun comes back up. Some phytoplankton do exactly the opposite. They need the sunshine. They'll make sure to come up near the surface during the daytime, and at night, to avoid all those zooplankton that are coming up near the surface, they may actually drop down. So there are lots of reasons why organisms can do that. Conserve energy, to avoid being eaten, to get hold of new nutrients. Deeper water might have nutrients that aren't available in the shallower parts of the ocean, and therefore they may go down, gather some nutrients, come back to the surface, and do some photosynthesis when the day comes again. In addition to those daily kinds of migrations, there are actually seasonal migrations, particularly in the polar oceans. So in the North Atlantic, copepods, and I'm sorry, I spelled that wrong, in the Antarctic, krill actually will migrate vertically depending on whether there's anything for them to eat, which there really isn't going to be during much of the winter. So they'll feed during the spring and the summer when there's lots of phytoplankton growing. They'll graze on them. And then when the growing season comes to an end, they'll kind of shut down for the rest of the year until it gets to be a good time to come up and graze again. And of course, we've already talked about the patchiness of plankton in the ocean, that in the surface of the ocean, the ocean as a whole is stratified by density. So water at the surface is less dense than the water underneath it. It takes energy to mix water vertically in the ocean. And so what tends to happen, unless something is causing that mixing to occur, is that eventually the surface waters will being stuck at the surface will tend to lose their nutrients as organisms grow in that water, take up nutrients, and then some of them die and sink out of the surface layers. In parts of the ocean where, for whatever reason, often because of upwelling, nutrients come up near the surface, phytoplankton is actually going to grow in great numbers relative to what it usually does. And you can see this from space. And this patchiness, this inhomogeneous dispersion of plankton in the ocean is actually a really important process for understanding the behavior of not just the plankton themselves, but actually lots of other organisms in the ocean. Again, where the photosynthesis is happening, for instance, here southeast of Nova Scotia in Canada, so Maine would be down here somewhere, like Bar Harbor, Maine. The rest of the ecosystem is actually going to respond. And that's actually what we're going to talk about in a minute, is essentially the rest of these ecosystems, starting with nectonic ecosystems and then moving on to benthic ecosystems next week, or maybe tomorrow, maybe Wednesday even. Are there any questions about plankton behavior? All right. So as we move from talking about plankton to talking about nectonic and benthic organisms, it's a natural place, although it's not quite perfect, to talk about multicellular life in general. When we talk about nectonic organisms, we're talking about organisms that are so large and strong as swimmers, they can actually counteract surface currents in the ocean. They can control their horizontal position. And that requires a certain minimum size, which effectively requires an organism that has many cells and that those cells are specialized to different purposes. So fish, for instance, are good examples of multicellular organisms, like these sardines from an aquarium, I think in Germany, but I'm not totally sure about that. And so this is an interesting place to talk about where do these multicellular organisms come from? How do you go from a single-celled organism to a multi-celled organism? And when in Earth's history did that actual innovation occur? It's actually pretty recent. Organisms analogous to what we recognize today as phytoplankton in the ocean, we have evidence, indirect or direct, from fossils or from chemical traces going back something like 2 to even 3.8 billion years. The oldest chemical evidence, something like 3.8 billion years. The oldest good fossils, a little bit younger. But going very far back in Earth's history, there's evidence that something like photosynthesis was happening. And yet we only see evidence of multicellular organisms with specialized cells analogous to fish, but even to crustaceans like the ostracods and copepods, going back 500 million years. Only a little over 10% of Earth's history. So it's quite recent, actually, that's occurred. And one idea is actually that you had to have photosynthesis first, that multicellular organisms, some of them are photosynthesizing organisms, many of them are respiring organisms, and in either case, they actually require a kind of fairly substantial, consistent supply of oxygen to live. And then it took until fairly recently in the fossil record for that level of oxygen to be achieved in the atmosphere, and thus to be probably dissolved in large concentrations in the ocean water. So there's chemical evidence of significant concentrations of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere going back to about 2.5 billion years ago. Before that, there's actually pretty good chemical evidence from the behavior of elements like sulfur and uranium, that there was very little oxygen in the environment for those elements to react with. Those are both elements that will react with oxygen and change their chemical behavior. After about 2.5 billion years, it appears that there's at least some trace of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. And that amount of oxygen perhaps increased not monotonically, not linearly, but in some rough back and forth way until by maybe 400 or 500 million years ago, oxygen had reached something like its modern concentration in the atmosphere, at least something like 10% oxygen in the atmosphere. Today, it's 20% oxygen in the atmosphere. And that rise in oxygen is going to make life, at least in principle, much easier for any organism that does respiration for a living, right? You need the oxygen, and then you have to get the organic material, and you can burn it in the presence of that oxygen to re-liberate the chemical energy that was stored by photosynthesis. And so that process of building up oxygen in the atmosphere may have been necessary, but it's not entirely clear, and there are actually arguments about why it took something like a couple of billion years for oxygen to appear in the atmosphere and then multicellular life to appear. But nonetheless, appear it did. And the first really compelling evidence for large multicellular organisms comes from fossils, and in particular from fossils that are of order 600 million years old, roughly. This would be right at the very end of the Precambrian era of history on Earth. And the first fossils that showed up are a little bit exotic, and it's not necessarily even clear what relationships they might have to organisms that live today. Here are a couple pictures from the most famous of these groups of organisms, the Ediacara fossil, the Ediacara fauna, named after a region in Australia. The fossil on the left is called Dickinsonia. The fossil in the middle there is called Cyclomedusa. It's not at all clear what this relates to in terms of modern organisms. This maybe looks superficially a little bit like a jellyfish or something. And then, after about 540 million years ago, actually we start seeing the actually fairly sudden appearance and radiation of organisms that are much more recognizable and in many cases can actually be correlated with groups of organisms that are alive today. One of the best areas to see fossils of this kind of beginning of modern multicellular life, recognizable in terms of relationships to modern organisms, is in a place in Canada called the Burgess Shale. And here is a picture of one organism from the Burgess Shale, which is about 505 million years old, so it's in the Cambrian period. And it's a little hard to see. It's an impression on this dark-colored shale. I played with the image a little bit to increase the contrast. And so it's still a little hard to see, but this is actually, broadly speaking, something that looks a little bit like a bug or a worm. The tail is here. It has these flaps along the side of its body. There's actually an eye stalk kind of thing, and then a feeding structure that comes out like this. It's got like a little feeding trunk that comes out of its mouth. And these organisms aren't very big. In particular, I brought in a couple examples of Dickinsonia here, which you can come up and see after the class is over. These are actually casts, so they're plastic that's been molded on top of an actual fossil surface. And the light's not that great, but hopefully at least those of you who are kind of near the front can see that there's kind of a shape here, and another shape here. So this is Dickinsonia from the Ediacaran. There's actually a green cast of another fossil of Dickinsonia up here. And then there's one actual fossil here, which is also of Dickinsonia, and you're going to have to come up to see it. Even if I had the best lights, you wouldn't be able to see it, but you can see an impression. These fossils in particular are typically found in sandstones. You don't actually see any leftovers from the bodies themselves. You just see the impression of the body as a shape pressed into the surface of the sand. And then finally, one other fossil from the Ediacaran, which is Tribrachidium, which is one of the weirdos of this fossil group that has unclear relationships to modern organisms, which again is an impression on the surface of this rock. It's very difficult to see from where you are right now, so I would really encourage you to come up after the end of class and take a closer look. I'll be happy to help point them out to you. So animals are actually relatively recent arrivals on the scene on Earth. Only in the last 10 or 12% of Earth's history have we had animals anything like we'd recognize today. We can divide up animals into a couple groups, and this is actually really crude, but nonetheless. We can divide them up into invertebrates, which in general don't have internal skeletons, and includes, of course, some of the simplest animals, including this fellow Obobinia from the Burgess Shale, for instance. Includes ostracods, includes copepods. And then there are vertebrates, that's the group in which we belong, which have an internal backbone, or at least some internal structure around the nerves, and presumably evolved from invertebrates. But it's worth pointing out that, in fact, at least the ancestors to vertebrates appear pretty early in the fossil record for animals, going back something like 500 million years. In fact, there are organisms, I don't think there are actually vertebrates in the Burgess Shale from 500 million years ago, but there are organisms that seem to have some sort of ancestral relationship to vertebrates that are found in that fossil locality. Okay. So when we talk about strong swimming organisms in the ocean, as opposed to plankton, we're actually now moving farther up the food chain to organisms that can actually swim strongly. And in general, these organisms are not doing photosynthesis. They have to live off of other organisms. They have to swim them down and consume them. So now we're talking about a different part of the food web, but one that we're very interested in because, of course, in terms of economic impacts, we mostly harvest larger organisms from the ocean. Those are the ones where economic value is largely concentrated. There's fairly little harvest of plankton in the ocean, although we do harvest benthic photosynthesizing organisms like kelp. And there are many, many types of animals in the ocean. There's no way, even though it's a really interesting aspect of oceanography, that I'm going to be able to talk about them all in a lecture or two. So I'm only going to focus in on essentially one group of invertebrates, the cephalopods, which I think are really cool, even though I don't know that much about them. And then I'm going to focus in on one group of vertebrates, the fish, and talk about those a little bit and kind of do a compare and contrast. So first, the cephalopods. And here's a charismatic example of a cephalopod. This is a Caribbean reef squid. Picture taken off the Wikimedia Commons. Cephalopods are invertebrates. In fact, they are mollusks. They have no internal skeleton, although squids and cuttlefish in particular, they have a firm sort of hard part in their bodies that's used for structural support. It's not actually related to the backbones in vertebrates. And cephalopod literally means head foot. And the basic idea is if you look at a picture of a cephalopod, like for instance another kind of squid, there are the tentacles that are actually coming out really near the head, and then the body is arranged behind that. So the eyes and the appendages are actually closely spatially arranged. You can also see that in the one modern example, modern surviving example of a shelled cephalopod. Most don't have shells, but the nautilus is an example that does have shells, and you can see sort of the eye and the tentacles while this guy's swimming along in his shell. The shell has not exactly air, but gas trapped up here that actually provides buoyancy, so the guy can actually float along and swim without having to expel energy to keep his shell from sinking. And it's worth pointing out also that cephalopods, actually this goes for fish and as well, these aren't organisms that are exclusively part of the nectonic community. Many of them also live along the bottom. In general, they aren't attached to the bottom, but organisms that can swim but nonetheless live most of their lives near the bottom are usually put with the benthic community and called perhaps nectobenthic organisms. Okay, so we talked about the origin of animals. It's worth mentioning the origin of cephalopods. They aren't the most ancient organisms in the fossil record, but they go back quite a ways. And this group includes squid, octopus, cuttlefish, nautilus in the modern ocean. There are actually lots of extinct relatives, including nautiloids and ammonites going back to something like 500 million years. So here's a 400 million year old or so shell skeleton from a nautiloid from China. And these organisms are actually really interesting for a number of reasons. They're ancient, they're pretty diverse, and they have lots of kind of interesting, unique abilities that make them almost charming, although a little bit vicious and scary in some other ways. One particular adaptation that these organisms have is that many of them can change color, and they can do so in really sophisticated ways and very quickly and dynamically, and often for reasons we don't actually understand. At least not yet. So for instance, octopi can change color to camouflage themselves against their background. And here's a video from a reef in Okinawa taken by a scuba diver. And let's see when you can find the octopus in the picture. So there's a fish there, and that fish is apparently annoying this octopus a little bit. And so the octopus decides to try to scare it away. But then he comes back and eventually decides to become part of the rock. So that would be pretty tough to spot if you hadn't seen him just changing color, wouldn't it? They can do a pretty good job and, in fact, be very difficult to spot. Okay, so that's pretty clear, right? This is an example of an octopus that's doing camouflage. He's hiding, essentially, by changing the color of his body. It's not always so clear what the motivation is. And in fact, there's a pretty active hobbyist cuttlefish raising community that you can borrow videos from. And cuttlefish are also cephalopods. They look superficially a little bit like squid. And they're kind of the color change masters. And in particular, it's common for cuttlefish to undergo fairly bold color changes in the act of hunting when they're actually trying to find food. It almost seems like they're getting excited, although of course you don't want to ascribe motives to an organism you can't actually talk to. But nonetheless, here's just a picture from somebody who owns a aquarium where they have a pet cuttlefish, and it's cuttlefish interacting with a small fish in the same aquarium. So you can draw your own conclusions. So the cuttlefish is on the left. There's the fish on the right. Cuttlefish seems kind of interested. And apparently cuttlefish are actually fairly vicious organisms, and there's some videos you can find on the web that are a little bit disconcerting. They're also kind of messy eaters. So, okay. So color change is definitely a strong ability of these organisms, and really remarkable. They get around in various ways. In fact, they can swim in a way that looks very similar, for instance, the way a penguin would swim or a mola mola in the ocean. And this is a Dumbo squid, a Grimpo. This is a movie taken from the Smithsonian. And he's just swimming along, flapping fins along his body surface very happily. And that's pretty common. Some cephalopods will have, instead of flipper-like fins, they'll have a line of fin going kind of around their bodies that they can ripple to move themselves. And cuttlefish in particular, when you were watching that cuttlefish hunting down the fish, he was swimming in much the same way. But when they're in a real hurry to get somewhere, or more likely to get away from something they perceive as danger, they can also employ jet propulsion by expelling fluid from their bodies. And they can also put ink into that fluid to sort of cover their escape, make a smoke screen, for instance. And so this is another picture of a deep sea squid taken from the Smithsonian Institution. And this one's kind of resting in an odd posture. So these are the tentacles kind of coming up like this, and this is the body stretched out this way, so the head is right around here. And he's just kind of sitting there as the camera gets closer and closer until he decides that the camera has gotten a little too close and decides to move away. Leaving a little bit of ink behind. So they can swim and they can propel themselves with jets. And of most of the ones I've showed you so far, these are very small, but of course they can get quite large, including the giant squid, which is one of the organisms, it's one of the largest organisms we know the least about in the ocean. In fact, until a few years ago, there had never been any video or photographic footage of a living giant squid. Now we actually do have some examples of giant squid on video that were captured near the coast of Japan. But for giant squid, pretty much all we know about them are the occasional carcasses that will wash up on a beach or float up to the ocean surface and be brought in by a fishing vessel or some such. And so where those organisms are found, of course, people are very eager to try to learn more about them to figure out what they eat. We know what eats them. Sperm whales are very commonly, where they're spotted or caught, carrying scars from what are apparently fairly vicious battles with giant squid. They have scars all around their mouths from the suckers of the giant squid, but we don't actually know that well what the squid themselves are doing. They clearly live fairly deep in the ocean. That's why we don't see them near the surface, but we don't know very much more about them. And it would be really interesting, presumably, these organisms can also change their color. Big thing, you know, flashing red and white or something like that when it gets excited. It'd be very interesting to see. Okay. So the cephalopods, cuttlefish, squid, octopi, nautiloids, they have lots of really interesting adaptations. They can change their color. They can engage jet propulsion when they need to get away from someplace fast. They can cover their escape with a smoke screen of ink. They have really advanced nervous systems. In fact, they're commonly studied in biomedical research because of their interesting nervous systems. They have very good eyesight. In fact, may be able to detect polarization in light, which we can't do very well. Why? What special problems do these organisms face, in particular the cuttlefish, the squid, and the octopi, that might lead them to develop all these special abilities? Yeah? Yeah, they have lots of predators. That's probably one of the, almost certainly is one of the reasons. And these are mollusks which have, by and large, abandoned their shells, right? They don't have shells anymore, even though many of their snaily relatives do. And therefore, they kind of have to get by on their wits. They can't really hide behind armor to avoid being eaten. And of course, this also frees them up to become much more active organisms. Part of the nectonic community, they're really, for mollusks, the only mollusks that are part of the nectonic community because they can swim strongly. They don't have to drag these heavy shells around with them anymore. But that, of course, raises its own problems. You can't hide. All right. Any questions about cephalopods? All right. So for the last 15 minutes or so, I'll start talking about fish. I may not get through it all today. These are perhaps the most familiar multicellular organisms in the ocean, perhaps after whales, and certainly the most prominent members of the tectonic community. And they come in lots of shapes and sizes. This is just a page taken from an old Finnish atlas that I found on the Wikipedia. Lots of different kinds of fish. They come in many shapes and sizes, but you can hopefully see some commonalities. In particular, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, that several of these kinds of fish have these special wide tails that turns out to make them really good at swimming fast, which is one of their major adaptations. But this isn't the entirety of the diversity of fish. In fact, if you go back farther into the fossil record to this transition from invertebrates, organisms without a backbone, to vertebrates, that actually occurred within the fishes. And there are fishes living today that actually don't have skeletons in much the way that we think of skeletons today. And in fact, they don't even have jaws. And there's a class of fish that falls into this category that includes two prominent examples, lampreys and hagfish. They don't have jaws, but they do have teeth, as it turns out. They have very flexible bodies, cartilaginous skeletons instead of bony ones. And today they mostly live as scavengers or parasites. Lampreys, which is what's pictured here, as adults, they're parasites. They actually find a large fishy host. They attach to the side of the host and actually burrow into the skin a little bit and live off the bodily fluids of their host. As juveniles, they actually aren't necessarily parasites. They actually live in the, at least in freshwater lampreys, they actually live in the sediment at the bottom of streams. Hagfish are largely scavengers. Those of you who came to the extra credit movie after the second midterm actually saw hagfish feeding on a whale carcass in the deep ocean. These are really interesting organisms because they seem to get around everywhere in the deep ocean. They can find sources of food fairly quickly and keep at them for a long time. But also, they're, as far as I know, the only living organism that is capable of tying itself in a knot. Not figuratively, but literally. And this is a sketch of a hagfish actually that has an overhand knot in its own body. And the basic idea is that this is a feeding strategy, that if this guy, remember, lacking jaws, lacking hands, is trying to rip off a piece of food from some tough whale carcass that's been sitting down there for a long time, it's going to have trouble sort of pulling that off. So what he does is he ties a knot from tail and pushes it towards his mouth. And when that knot comes over the head, it kind of pushes the head away and actually can rip off a little bit of food for him. These guys are actually even cooler than that. They have a particularly neat adaptation for when they get in trouble. They can't swim very fast, so they can't do the jet propulsion thing that many cephalopods do. They kind of do something even weirder, and I hope nobody had Jell-O for lunch. So this is an experiment at the University of British Columbia. This is a hagfish, and he's going to get shocked just a little bit. And you can see that there's this little goo that comes out where he was shocked that's being scraped off here with a little spatula. So it's a tiny amount of that material. And it's just going to mix it in with 100 milliliters or so of water. And here comes the specially modified coat hanger. Remember, a tiny, tiny amount of the stuff that came out of the hagfish when it was shocked, when it was disturbed. And that's the beaker upside down, basically. There's no water left in it. So basically, the hagfish's response to being in danger when it's disturbed, or in this case, shocked, is that it releases this material that essentially turns water into slime. And it turns a very little bit of this material actually turned a tremendous amount of water, relatively speaking, into this slimy goo that was no longer really capable of flowing like liquid water would. And so one idea is, in fact, that what this does, if it's being attacked by a fish, for instance, this slime essentially turns water into a not liquid anymore and gums up the mouth parts and gills of whatever is trying to eat it, making it difficult for that organism to breathe. So it's like essentially suffocating whatever is trying to attack it with a giant gob of phlegm, which is a pretty interesting way to get out of this problem of not being eaten when you don't have a shell. Okay. Now, the more familiar members of this group would include sharks and the bony fish, and we'll talk about sharks a little bit first. Sharks are a pretty ancient group. They don't go back quite as far as the jawless fishes, but they go back at least something like 400 million years. They're pretty convincing-looking fossil sharks going back a long way, and they're pretty common. In fact, shark teeth are probably the most common fossil of any kind of vertebrate in the fossil record in general. You find shark teeth all over the place. And in part, this is because of the way that sharks use teeth. They kind of use them for a little while, and then they get lost and are replaced more or less continuously. So there are lots of teeth being shed into the ocean. That's also partly a consequence of what the teeth are made out of. Shark teeth are actually made out of similar materials to our teeth. The enamel in our teeth is a mineral, or contains a mineral called apatite, which is a calcium phosphate mineral. It's actually quite hard, so it's a good thing to make teeth out of, and very durable. It doesn't dissolve as easily in slightly acidic waters as calcium carbonate does, and they're big, unlike diatoms, so they tend to dissolve relatively slowly. So they survive in the fossil record very well. In fact, much better than bones, which don't have aren't as well mineralized as enamels and teeth are. So tooth enamel is actually a really important part of the geological record, and in fact, a lot of people in my subfield of geology and geochemistry are very interested in figuring out what kind of chemical information you can get by looking at things like shark teeth because they're so well preserved in the fossil record going back so long into Earth's history. It's a really diverse group, going back having at least 700 or so species, and includes both organisms that live in the nectonic community, like our friend the great white shark, or the whale shark, which is perhaps a little bit gentler, if larger. And there are also organisms that tend to live on the bottom of the ocean and be part of the nectobenthic community, or the benthic community, including most rays, but not the manta ray, which is actually also a nectonic organism. And kind of got a bad rap from the pearl, I have to say, if any of you have read that book. Sharks don't have bony skeletons. The skeletons are made out of organic material, cartilage, which is the same stuff that kind of makes the softer structures in our bodies, like our nose and our earlobes. But they do have hard parts, including the teeth and including the organic material making up their scales. And in particular, the sharks that tend to swim fairly fast or frequently through the ocean have scales that overlap and have corrugations in them. So the head of the shark would be towards this direction. In this case, this is from a thresher shark. And the tail would be this way. And as water flows over the surface, it's possible that these grooves actually help keep the water from becoming turbulent and therefore lower the resistance to swimming at high speed that these organisms feel as they go through the water. These are fairly hard in many cases, and in some kinds of sharks, they're actually pointy on the tail end. And so if you ever get a chance to pet a shark, which sounds like it would be pretty cool, actually, try not to pet the wrong way. Actually, it can be an unpleasant experience for both you and the shark. It's also worth pointing out that, although we haven't mentioned this because we haven't gotten to bony fish yet, sharks tend not to have, in fact, don't have gas bladders inside their bodies. This is an organ that we don't really have, but most bony fish do have. A little organ in their bodies which is usually filled with gas, with something like air, except they don't actually breathe air. And they can shrink or enlarge this organ essentially to control their own buoyancy. We talked about this in the context of diatoms putting oils or joining together into chains to keep themselves from sinking. Most fish actually have this organ that they can use to control their buoyancy, so they can sit there in the water column without having to expend energy to keep swimming upwards so that they don't sink to the bottom. Sharks actually don't have this adaptation, and that means that in general, if a shark wants to not be on the bottom or at the surface, they have to expend energy to swim to control their vertical position in the ocean. And that takes some energy, but it's actually really common not just for sharks, but for bony fish that are hunters, that have to swim up and down fairly quickly to not have a swim bladder or to have a very small one. because, of course, pressure changes with your vertical position in the ocean, and gases expand and contract depending on what the pressure is. So an organism with a large swim bladder, if it tries to swim up really fast, that bladder is going to tend to expand. And that's not very good. It's generally bad news if one of your internal organs is expanding quickly. And in fact, when we used to do otter trawls at about 100 feet of depth in the Santa Monica Bay, we'd pull up the fish, and in fact, the free-swimming fish, like the little perch, would not do very well with that decompression experience. In fact, they generally died from it. But the organisms like flounders that don't generally have big swim bladders because they just sit on the bottom all day, they don't really need to control their buoyancy, they were perfectly happy. Although they probably weren't very happy to be brought up from their house onto the surface, but nonetheless, they seemed to survive the experience relatively well. All right, so while we're talking about sharks, it's worth mentioning that, of course, they're kind of scary looking, and we have all these wonderful movies about how they eat people all the time, particularly when they're genetically engineered, but otherwise if they're just really big and hungry. And it's worth pointing out that, yes, people do get attacked by sharks. People occasionally get eaten by sharks, or at least killed by them, but it is incredibly rare. And unless you're a surfer hanging out in a place where fur seals are in the process of being born or something, it's not the first order thing you should be worried about when you're in the water. This is a map that's compiled at the Florida Museum of Natural History of all historically recorded shark attacks, including fatalities and non-fatalities. And the important thing to realize is that for as long as records have been kept in the United States, in U.S. waters, a total of 39 people have been killed in an unprovoked shark attack, which amounts to something like 1 every few years. Okay, it's really, really uncommon for people to be attacked by sharks, and even more uncommon for people to be killed by sharks. All right, are there any questions? All right, on Wednesday, we'll talk about bony fish and start talking about benthic communities like coral reefs and kelp.